She had been working in the sprawling mansion for years, quietly moving through the rooms, dusting the shelves, polishing the floors, and making sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes. Most people hardly noticed her presence beyond the occasional greeting or nod, yet she had developed a rhythm of observation that came from years of attentiveness. On that particular morning, she entered the study where the CEO usually began his day. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The coffee was brewed, the papers were stacked neatly, the sunlight streamed through the blinds. But something about the way he moved caught her eye. His posture was slightly off, his hand trembled as he reached for a pen, and there was a faint pallor in his face that she couldn't ignore. These weren't dramatic or obvious symptoms. Anyone else might have brushed them off as fatigue or stress, but she had a practiced eye for noticing the little things that others missed. She remembered the countless times over the years she had seen subtle signs of discomfort or unease in the people she cared for quietly, the way a slight slump of the shoulders or a change in facial expression could signal something deeper. She paused for a moment, watching him sit at his desk, and her mind cataloged everything she saw. The faint flush around his cheeks, the way he winced slightly as he lifted his arm, the repeated rubbing of his temple, all tiny indicators that something was off. These details didn't scream danger, but to her, they formed a pattern that triggered concern. In her years of experience, she had learned that the difference between noticing and ignoring could be monumental, that small, almost invisible cues often preceded major events. Her instincts, honed over countless days of careful observation, were telling her that this was not just another morning routine. She considered her own position, a black maid in a household of wealth and influence, someone whose voice was often overlooked. Yet, in that moment, the stakes were higher than social dynamics or hierarchies. It was about life itself. She debated briefly in her mind, weighing whether she should mention her observations or let it slide, knowing full well that her concerns might be dismissed. The hesitation was brief because the subtle signs were persistent, and her inner voice would not let her ignore them. She knew from prior experience that early detection of issues, no matter how minor they seemed, could be critical, and that even professionals could overlook patterns visible to someone paying close attention. As she continued her routine, her eyes never left him, noting every minor shift in expression, every sigh, every involuntary movement. She reflected on previous times when small details had revealed larger problems. The time a tiny stain in the kitchen indicated a hidden leak, or when a faint odor alerted her to a forgotten appliance left on, preventing serious damage. Her mind, trained to connect small clues to larger consequences, was now analyzing this human puzzle in front of her. She observed his breathing, slightly uneven, shallow in places, and the subtle tension in his shoulders. She noticed the color of his lips and the way his fingers flexed nervously against the edge of the desk. These were things that could be easily missed, especially by people who assumed that wealth, health, and status automatically equated to normalcy. She had learned that real observation required patience and focus, an ability to see beyond what was expected and to trust one's own senses over assumptions or appearances. While the staff and family members had been in and out of the room, laughing and chatting, she remained quietly attentive, blending into the background but recording everything her eyes captured. She noted that even his morning routine seemed slightly altered. He skipped the usual cup of coffee, delayed opening certain files, and lingered longer on tasks that were normally automatic. All of these small deviations added up in her mind, painting a picture that demanded attention. Her awareness extended beyond physical signs. She sensed subtle shifts in mood and energy, the type of things that are not taught in manuals but understood through lived experience. She felt a deep responsibility, an unspoken obligation, because she had learned that the unnoticed often carried the weight of truth. As she went about her duties, she mentally cataloged everything, connecting each microsignal to potential underlying issues. The faint tremor in his hand, the odd hesitation in movement, the repeated rubbing of his forehead, altogether they formed a constellation of anomalies that no one else had paused to recognize. She understood that the everyday busyness of the household, the constant flow of tasks and distractions, often caused people to overlook signs that were in plain sight. It was precisely this environment of assumption and routine that made her vigilance even more critical. She reflected on how often small observations can make the difference between disaster and safety, between a minor issue and a life-threatening one. Her mind ran through possible explanations for what she saw, ruling out fatigue and simple stress because the symptoms were persistent, subtle, and interconnected in ways that suggested something more serious. This process was not conscious calculation, but an ingrained pattern of perception, shaped by years of quietly watching, noticing, and understanding the significance of the overlooked. The more she observed, the more convinced she became that she could not let these signs go unremarked, that ignoring them would be a mistake with potentially catastrophic consequences. Every gesture, every flicker of expression, every minute alteration in routine became data points in her silent assessment, and she felt a growing urgency that demanded action. Her awareness was not limited to the obvious. She noticed minor things like the uneven placement of objects on his desk, the slight hesitancy in turning pages, the way he shifted his weight, all of which to an outsider might seem trivial, but to her signaled imbalance. She considered the pattern as a whole, understanding that illness or crisis often manifests first in subtle ways, before it becomes undeniable. Her attention to these signs was meticulous, almost instinctual, and it gave her a perspective that no one else in the mansion had at that moment. She understood that the power of observation lay in noticing the unnoticed, in trusting what others disregard, and in having the courage to act when everyone else is blind to the warning signals. Despite her growing concern, when she first tried to bring up what she had noticed, she was met with indifference. The household was a whirlwind of activity every morning, assistants rushing in and out, family members exchanging greetings, staff focused on tasks that seemed urgent but were ultimately routine. She had approached the CEO's personal assistant, a well-dressed man who managed schedules and filtered information with the precision of someone trained to prioritize efficiency over nuance. She mentioned casually, almost tentatively, the slight pallor she had observed, the tremor in his hand, the unusual fatigue that seemed to linger despite a full night's rest. The assistant smiled politely, nodded, and returned to his phone, replying to emails and phone calls as if her observation were a trivial note, not a potential alarm bell. That dismissive reaction could have discouraged anyone, but she had learned early on that her role often required persistence in the face of disbelief. She tried again, this time speaking to a family member who visited the study regularly, mentioning the subtle changes she had seen over the past few days. The response was a patronizing chuckle, a wave of the hand, a casual remark about stress or overwork, as if anyone of their social standing could not possibly be affected by something as mundane as minor health issues. The dismissal stung, but it did not deter her. She knew that those in positions of power and privilege were often shielded from the realities that everyone else had to navigate, and that this shield often bred overconfidence in the ability to ignore small warning signs. She turned her attention to the other staff members, chefs, drivers, cleaners, sharing in hushed tones what she had noticed, hoping for a collective sense of awareness, perhaps even validation. Yet the response was the same, a shrug, a nod, a quiet, "We'll keep an eye on it," spoken more as a formality than a genuine acknowledgement of the possible danger. She recognized the pattern. When people are accustomed to authority, comfort, or wealth, they often allow assumptions to override observation, and what she saw as critical, they saw as negligible. The more she tried to communicate, the more she realized that her concerns were being filtered through layers of perception that rendered them invisible. She understood that it wasn't personal malice, but a systemic failure to notice what was not immediately urgent or obvious. Doctors, for example, when finally consulted, were courteous but clinical, focused on scheduled checkups and standard panels. They examined him during routine visits, listened to his own assurances that he was fine, and left without raising alarms. They relied heavily on self-reporting and visible symptoms, and they failed to catch the subtle cues she had been tracking: tiny shifts in expression, minor hesitations, faint tremors. Even when she pressed for a more careful examination, they nodded politely but seemed unconvinced, treating her words as anecdotal rather than actionable. Within the household, the hierarchy of attention was clear. The CEO's comfort and perception of health were taken at face value, and those of lower status, even those who had intimate, daily exposure, were not trusted to interpret the signals accurately. The maid, aware of her position, had to navigate this carefully. Any insistence risked being seen as overstepping boundaries, yet silence carried far greater risk. She reflected on how often this dynamic played out in her life. Those who had the power to act were often insulated from the very evidence that demanded their intervention, while those who saw the signs clearly were marginalized or ignored. This realization fueled a quiet determination in her. If everyone else was blind, she would need to maintain vigilance herself, document observations meticulously, and find ways to amplify her concerns despite the dismissive responses. Her experience taught her that persistence was not just a matter of will, but a necessary tool for survival and prevention. She also noticed the subtle ways dismissal was reinforced socially. Jokes, side comments, laughter at the idea that someone of her position could know anything critical about the health of a wealthy, powerful individual. Yet she understood that this was a test of focus and courage. She could not allow societal hierarchy or social discomfort to cloud the importance of what she had observed. Each interaction in which her warnings were minimized became a data point, a reminder of the inertia and disbelief she was up against. She began strategizing on how to communicate in ways that could penetrate this layer of indifference, thinking of approaches that combined timing, careful phrasing, and evidence from her observations. She knew that inaction by others could have catastrophic consequences, and that the very people with authority might act only if the danger became undeniable. In the quiet moments, while performing her daily duties, she reflected on the gravity of being unheard, the frustration of watching critical signs ignored, and the sense of responsibility that pressed down on her shoulders. She considered past situations in her life where intuition had been dismissed and how outcomes could have been different if someone had simply listened. The pattern repeated itself in subtle ways across households, workplaces, and communities. Those who notice are often not the ones granted the power to act, yet their vigilance can make the difference between safety and disaster. She cataloged the reactions she encountered: the polite nods, the superficial reassurances, the subtle condescension, and mentally prepared for the possibility that she might have to bypass conventional channels entirely to ensure that her observations led to intervention. Every dismissive remark became a reminder of the stakes. Every ignored concern strengthened her resolve, and every casual response from others underscored the isolation that often comes with being the first to perceive danger. She understood that this was not just about being right. It was about bridging a gap between perception and action, about ensuring that the unnoticed signs were not lost in a sea of routine and assumption. She kept detailed mental notes of every symptom, every interaction, and every subtle deviation from normal behavior, knowing that this record could prove invaluable if she needed to make a decisive move. By the time she realized the full extent of what she had observed, the situation had reached a critical point where hesitation could have had severe consequences. She had been watching closely for several days, noting subtle changes in the CEO's behavior that seemed minor on the surface but formed a concerning pattern when viewed together. The tremor in his hand persisted, and she noticed a slight slurring of speech that had gone unnoticed by others who interacted with him briefly. His energy levels fluctuated unusually, and he showed signs of disorientation during routine conversations, forgetting small but significant details. These were not dramatic events. To an outsider, they might have seemed trivial or explainable by stress, fatigue, or a busy schedule. Yet she knew from experience that the combination of such subtle indicators often presaged a serious health crisis. Her mind raced as she considered what could happen if no one acted. She reflected on the countless times she had seen minor issues escalate because they were ignored, whether it was a leaking pipe that became a flood or a small appliance malfunction that led to fire. The principle was the same with human health. Ignoring early warning signs could lead to catastrophe. She understood that preventive action, even if inconvenient or socially uncomfortable, was essential. With a sense of urgency, she decided that waiting for someone else to notice would be too risky. She gathered all her observations, recalling each detail with precision. The uneven breathing, the pale complexion, the subtle tremors, the fleeting moments of confusion, the hesitation in routine tasks. She reviewed the timeline in her mind, noting when each symptom had appeared and how it had changed over time. She realized that early intervention could mean the difference between a minor health scare and a life-threatening emergency. Acting quickly was no longer optional. It was imperative. She approached the CEO directly, speaking carefully but firmly, pointing out the patterns she had noticed and expressing her concern in clear, specific terms. She emphasized that she had observed these changes over several days and that while they might seem small individually, together they suggested a serious underlying problem. Her tone was calm, yet insistent, designed to convey both urgency and credibility without causing alarm or defensiveness. The initial reaction was surprise, a flicker of doubt, but she persisted, citing specific examples from recent days, describing precisely what she had seen and when. She emphasized that her concern came from careful observation, not conjecture or exaggeration. At first, there was hesitation, as if the weight of the situation had only just become apparent, and the CEO's staff scrambled to assess the validity of her claims. Her insistence, coupled with the clarity of her observations, prompted them to arrange an immediate medical evaluation. Doctors were called in, and the CEO underwent a series of tests and examinations. The medical team soon discovered a critical condition that had been developing silently, something that required prompt intervention. The subtle signs she had noticed had been overlooked by everyone else, including family members, assistants, and even prior medical checkups. But her vigilance had ensured that the danger was addressed before it escalated further. She reflected on the importance of acting decisively once the signs were recognized. In such situations, timeliness is as crucial as accuracy. Hesitation can allow minor issues to spiral into severe emergencies. Her actions were a demonstration of how knowledge, observation, and courage combined could prevent a tragedy that might have seemed inevitable to those unaware of the early warning signs. She understood that the environment of wealth and status could sometimes insulate individuals from reality, creating a false sense of security. Her intervention had cut through that complacency, ensuring that the unseen threat was acknowledged and dealt with promptly. As the medical team worked to stabilize the CEO, she continued to observe, providing support where necessary and documenting any changes she noticed. Her meticulous attention to detail, which had initially been dismissed, became an invaluable resource in guiding the immediate course of care. Each small observation, his breathing patterns, his responsiveness, his color, helped inform the doctor's decisions and ensured that treatment was tailored effectively. She realized that preventive action is often undervalued because it is invisible when successful. The crisis that is avoided leaves no dramatic trace, only the quiet reassurance of safety. Her role in this scenario exemplified the critical impact of early detection and proactive intervention. It was not a matter of heroics, but of diligence, attentiveness, and the courage to act despite the risk of being ignored or dismissed. The lesson was clear: timely action, grounded in careful observation, can prevent disasters that others might consider unavoidable. Her decision to act, guided by intuition and reinforced by careful observation, demonstrated that even those in positions of lower authority can wield extraordinary influence when they recognize danger and intervene appropriately. She reflected on the significance of maintaining vigilance, particularly when others are complacent or distracted by routine. Preventive action is most powerful when it is taken before the situation becomes apparent to the broader group, before obvious symptoms manifest, and before inaction could result in irreversible consequences. Each step she took was deliberate, informed by an understanding that human health can deteriorate subtly, yet rapidly, if unchecked. The urgency she felt was matched by the clarity of her observations, and together they ensured that she could act in a way that truly made a difference. She understood the fragile balance between risk and responsibility, and how timely intervention could save not only health, but life. As the situation unfolded, it became increasingly clear just how pivotal her observations had been in preserving the CEO's life. When the doctors arrived, they quickly recognized the seriousness of the condition that had been developing silently, a condition that could have escalated rapidly without intervention. She had noticed the subtle changes that hinted at a much larger underlying problem, changes so faint that even trained medical professionals might have overlooked them if not prompted by her insistence. Every tremor in his hand, every slight hesitation in speech, every minor lapse in memory she had documented became crucial clues for the medical team, helping them pinpoint the source of the problem with far greater speed and accuracy than would have otherwise been possible. The CEO, initially skeptical of the severity, soon realized through the doctor's explanations that without her vigilance, the outcome could have been catastrophic. He listened carefully as the physicians detailed the sequence of symptoms and how they correlated with the diagnosis, recognizing that what had seemed minor to others had been a critical warning. In that moment, the reality of her impact became undeniable, not just to the CEO, but to everyone present in the room. Staff members who had previously dismissed her warnings now looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect, realizing that their own inattention could have led to a disaster. She had done more than observe. She had acted decisively, bridging the gap between subtle signs and meaningful intervention. It was her attention to detail, her refusal to let assumptions cloud her judgment, and her courage to speak up despite her position in the household hierarchy that had shifted the trajectory from potential tragedy to safety. She had managed to navigate the social dynamics of the household effectively, communicating her concerns in a way that compelled action without provoking resistance or defensiveness. This balance of tact and urgency had proven essential, demonstrating that influence is not solely derived from title or status, but from clarity of insight and the ability to act on it. Her intervention had ripple effects beyond the immediate medical emergency. The CEO's health, which could have deteriorated rapidly, was now stabilized, allowing him to continue leading his company and managing his personal life without the interruption that a sudden health crisis would have caused. The doctors, impressed by the preciseness of her observations, noted that early detection had significantly increased the likelihood of a positive outcome, reducing the risk of complications and ensuring that treatment could proceed with optimal timing. She had essentially provided a lifeline, translating what could have been an unnoticed decline into actionable intelligence that ultimately saved a life. The respect and gratitude she received were profound, not merely because she had done her duty, but because she had transcended the limitations imposed by others' assumptions about her role. She had demonstrated that vigilance and care are forms of expertise in their own right, capable of influencing outcomes at the highest levels. As the CEO recovered under careful supervision, he frequently acknowledged her presence, often pausing to ask about observations or small details she had noted during those critical days. Her insight continued to inform decisions about his health, including lifestyle adjustments and preventive measures that might have been overlooked if the crisis had occurred without her intervention. She had become an indispensable part of the chain of care, a reminder that those closest to daily life often see what even experts might miss. Her role also prompted a subtle shift in the household's culture. Staff members began to listen more attentively, to consider carefully what might be happening beneath the surface, and to recognize the value of observations from all corners of the home. Her courage in speaking up set a precedent. Vigilance and concern were not bound by hierarchy, and proactive attention could change outcomes in ways that authority alone could not. The incident also underscored a larger truth about human health and organizational awareness, the importance of combining careful observation with timely action. It illustrated that while formal expertise is invaluable, it can be complemented and enhanced by those who live alongside the people in question, noticing shifts that may not register in routine assessments. Every detail she had observed, the slight tremor, the pale complexion, the changes in behavior, had converged to provide the doctors with a clearer, more immediate understanding of what needed to be done. Her attentiveness had created a bridge between subtle warning signs and life-saving medical intervention, demonstrating that careful observation, when coupled with courage and decisive communication, can have profound consequences. As the CEO gradually regained strength and stability, it became evident to everyone that her role had been instrumental in preventing a disaster that could have had far-reaching repercussions, not only for him personally, but for his family, his employees, and the larger network of people dependent on his leadership and decisions. She had seen what others ignored, acted on it, and in doing so, had preserved not just health but the continuity of life and responsibility. She had always understood, from years of experience, that small details can carry enormous weight, that tiny, almost imperceptible signs can indicate far more than they appear to on the surface. In her work, she had learned to observe not just the obvious but the nuances, the fleeting expressions, the slight hesitations, the changes in routine or posture that might go unnoticed by anyone else. On that particular morning, when she noticed the CEO's unusual pallor, the subtle tremor in his hand, and the hesitation in his movements, she immediately recognized that these were not isolated anomalies but interconnected signals that demanded attention. She knew that in complex systems, whether a household, an organization, or the human body, small variations can cascade into major consequences if ignored. This understanding had been reinforced countless times. A missed spill could lead to a serious accident. A slight imbalance in a household schedule could escalate into chaos. And in human health, minor symptoms often precede major crises. Her ability to perceive the significance of these small details was not innate, but cultivated through years of careful attention, patience, and reflection. She had learned that vigilance requires not just looking but interpreting, connecting dots that others might consider irrelevant or trivial. The subtle tremor in his hand, which others brushed off as fatigue or stress, immediately struck her as a warning sign. She noted the way his eyes seemed slightly sunken, the pallor in his complexion, the faint tension in his shoulders that suggested discomfort or strain. To anyone else, these might have been overlooked or dismissed as ordinary variations in energy and expression, but to her, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. Each small observation she made was part of a larger picture, and her experience had taught her to trust that instinct, to act on what she saw rather than waiting for confirmation from others who might not notice or might undervalue what they did notice. She reflected on the countless scenarios in her life where small details had mattered: a loose doorknob that signaled deeper structural problems, a minor leak in the kitchen that could have caused significant damage, a subtle shift in a family member's mood that presaged conflict or distress. These experiences had instilled in her an acute awareness of how much influence small, overlooked elements can exert on larger outcomes. When she observed the CEO's symptoms, she recognized that ignoring them could have catastrophic consequences. The subtle signs, if left unheeded, might evolve into a serious medical emergency, something that even a well-resourced household could not immediately remedy. She felt a profound sense of responsibility because she realized that noticing the details was only part of the equation. She also had to ensure that they were acted upon. Her reflections extended beyond the immediate situation. She understood that in any environment, whether professional, personal, or communal, the tendency to focus on the obvious often blinds people to the underlying realities that truly matter. Important signals are often quiet, subtle, and easy to dismiss, yet they carry disproportionate weight in determining outcomes. This principle applied in her household, where the pace of life, the hierarchy of authority, and the distractions of daily routine could easily render critical cues invisible to those who were not paying careful attention. Her observations were meticulous. She noted the cadence of his speech, the micro-expressions in his face, the slight delays in completing tasks he normally handled with ease. Each minute detail reinforced her concern and underscored the importance of attentive observation. She compared the present situation with past experiences in her career, drawing parallels between subtle indicators of potential problems and the major consequences that had followed when those signs were ignored. In all these cases, she saw a consistent pattern. Minor deviations often precede major crises, and the act of noticing can itself be transformative. She realized that her role required a combination of perception, interpretation, and courage, the ability to recognize what is significant, to understand the potential consequences, and to act even when others might dismiss or question her judgment. The lesson was clear. Attention to detail is not merely about precision or diligence. It is about foresight, prevention, and the capacity to influence outcomes in meaningful ways. She understood that the seemingly small details, the faint tremor, the subtle pallor, the hesitation in routine movements, were actually signals of something far more consequential. By treating them with the seriousness they deserved, by observing carefully and persistently, she had positioned herself to intervene in a situation where inaction could have led to irreversible consequences. Every observation she recorded, every subtle symptom she noted, became part of a body of knowledge that could inform immediate action and prevent disaster. She knew that this principle extended beyond individual health. In business, relationships, and life, it is often the overlooked details that determine success or failure, safety or risk, stability or collapse. Her awareness of the disproportionate impact of small details shaped every decision she made in those critical moments, guiding her to act with precision, clarity, and urgency. She had always understood that listening to everyone, regardless of status or position, was not just a matter of courtesy but a necessity, a principle that could make the difference between disaster and safety. In the household, as in life, voices were often filtered through layers of perceived importance. The CEO's family and assistants had built a framework in which authority and wealth dictated whose concerns were taken seriously and whose were easily dismissed. Yet she had learned through experience that true insight often comes from those who are closest to the details, those who observe quietly and consistently over time. Her position as a black maid in a wealthy household gave her an unusual vantage point. She saw patterns and behaviors that others, distracted by hierarchy, privilege, or routine, overlooked. She noticed small shifts in the CEO's health, changes so subtle that anyone without careful attention might have missed them entirely. When she first mentioned these observations to staff members and family, they were brushed off with polite nods or dismissive remarks, as though her words were not worthy of serious consideration. But she knew that listening to everyone mattered precisely because critical information often comes from unexpected sources. Each observation she made was grounded in careful attention, built on years of experience reading micro-expressions, noting minor changes in behavior, and connecting seemingly unrelated details into a coherent pattern. She recognized that her insights, while informal and outside the usual chain of authority, were invaluable because they provided a perspective no one else had. Her awareness of this dynamic strengthened her resolve to speak up, even when others ignored her. She understood that in high-stakes situations, the voices that are often silenced or overlooked are sometimes the very ones that can prevent catastrophe. The subtle symptoms she had observed, the tremor in his hand, the unusual fatigue, the hesitation in routine movements, were not dramatic, but they formed a constellation of warning signs that demanded attention. If no one had listened to her, the situation could have escalated rapidly. She also realized that listening is not just passive hearing. It requires engagement, attention, and a willingness to suspend judgment. Many in the household failed at this, dismissing her observations because of her role rather than evaluating the evidence she presented. Her own approach was different. She prepared her observations carefully, articulating them clearly, and presented them in a manner designed to be understood by those who might otherwise discount her insights. She understood that communication, when combined with careful observation, is a tool of influence even in environments where social hierarchy seems absolute. Her insistence that others pay attention was grounded in practical necessity, not arrogance. She recognized that the CEO's life depended on timely recognition of warning signs, and that those signs were often invisible to people who only interacted with him briefly or superficially. Listening to her observations allowed the household to act before the subtle health issues turned into a full-blown crisis. She also noticed that listening to everyone has broader implications beyond the immediate emergency. It fosters an environment in which vigilance is shared, patterns are noticed sooner, and risks are mitigated before they escalate. Her experience underscored that information from unexpected sources can be the most reliable, because it comes from those who are unencumbered by assumptions, social pressures, or preconceived notions. Her intervention exemplified the principle that those on the periphery often have the clearest view of what is unfolding. By listening to her, the household was able to access a perspective that had been ignored for too long. She had cultivated a habit of noticing everything, the smallest changes in demeanor, the rhythm of daily activities, the subtle signs of discomfort, and she recognized that such observations only become useful when they are heard and acted upon. Her ability to bridge the gap between observation and intervention highlighted the vital role of listening across social and hierarchical boundaries. She also understood that listening involves trust, both in the observer and in the message conveyed. Many in the household initially lacked that trust, underestimating her insight because of her social position. Yet the clarity and consistency of her observations gradually overcame skepticism, demonstrating that trust can be earned not through status, but through accuracy, attentiveness, and persistence. The unfolding events illustrated how critical it is to recognize the value of every voice in a system, whether in a household, a workplace, or any structured environment. When people dismiss input based on who delivers it rather than what is delivered, they risk missing signals that could avert danger. Her insistence on being heard, and the eventual acknowledgement of her observations, transformed the situation from one of potential crisis to one of proactive care. Listening to everyone, she realized, is not just a moral or ethical stance, it is a practical necessity. It allows for a more complete understanding of complex situations, ensures that subtle warnings are not overlooked, and can directly impact outcomes in life or death scenarios. Her experience reinforced the lesson that no matter how small or seemingly insignificant a voice might appear, it may carry information crucial to the well-being of those in positions of responsibility. By valuing her input, the household was able to take action in time, illustrating the transformative power of attentive listening. Every subtle sign she had observed became meaningful only because someone finally chose to listen, validating her role and emphasizing the importance of paying attention to all sources of insight, regardless of origin.